The enemy has attacked Kharkiv once again. Once more, there have been terrorist strikes targeting civilian infrastructure, as well as in the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. But Ukrainian forces are striking back because, for example, the occupation resources, the resources of the occupiers, as well as collaborators and traitors from the so-called local authorities in the occupied parts of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, are complaining that a large number of drones are targeting Russian military facilities in these occupied territories. So once again, the Ukrainian Defense Forces summer campaign continues, and it consists precisely of using this kind of asymmetry to gain an advantage through such strikes. We are defending ourselves. We are on the defensive. And in order to make our defense even more effective, it is precisely these kinds of special operations that will contribute to that. As the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, President Zelensky, noted, Putin and Russia know that there will be further operations, but of course they do not know where or when. That's why there's panic. Of course, the counter-terrorist regimes and other so-called regimes that Russia is now implementing will lead to hunts, paranoia, like how they are stopping and inspecting all trucks, fearing that new drones might fly out of them, and so on. But at the same time, of course, certain difficulties may arise because this regime will be strengthened. They will really try to look under almost every bush, every tree, every branch, and undoubtedly it may now be somewhat more difficult to carry out something that was planned earlier, but it is not impossible. This also needs to be understood. And remember, in the previous video I talked about the version reported by the French publication Le Monde, which spoke with French experts in the defense and security sectors, that without the participation of the United States of America, which provided at least communications, intelligence, and coordination, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, for Ukraine to carry out an operation of such scale as Webb directly on Russian territory, destroying the Russian aviation fleet. But for example, and you have to understand that this could have happened, by the way, regardless of other factors. That is, it doesn't necessarily mean that this was approved by Donald Trump or anything like that. In general, internal resistance to the American president may gradually increase, because by no means does everyone in the United States share or will share the course set by the US president. That's obvious. Moreover, I think it's only a matter of time before senators, congressmen, and perhaps even American law enforcement agencies start asking Trump why there is such a strong affinity for Russia. Why is it necessary once again to talk to Putin on the phone, which is something we'll discuss now? By the way, soon the 2 weeks will be up. The next 2 weeks that Trump gave Putin for the Russian dictator to take some steps toward a ceasefire and to demonstrate real willingness to end the war. Where is this will? That's why I don't rule out that someone in the American intelligence services, in the agencies, might really suspect that Trump could be a recruited agent of the KGB or FSB by Krasnov, as was reported by the former head of the KGB of Kazakhstan back at the beginning of Trump's term as president. And that's exactly why, in various ways, he avoids holding Russia accountable. Moreover, look, there was information that US President Trump asked the Senate to temporarily not consider the bill to strengthen sanctions against Russia. This was stated by Committee Chairman Wicker. Well, in fact, here you go. Once again, this is playing into Russia's hands, once again softening the stance toward Putin. It's just unclear why. But I'll tell you that in this whole possible KGB FSB conspiracy to recruit Americans, there is some progress. Because look, well, Putin calls Trump, and the main theme of this whole conversation is supposedly, in fact, Putin asking Trump to help him protect. And once again, he asks the Americans to help influence official Kiev to stop, to prevent future operations like Web or strikes on the Crimean Bridge. In other words, Putin is literally asking Trump for help so that the US would pressure Ukraine not to carry out such operations. Moreover, we can see this. Let's analyze it. And again, why did Putin end up in a mess? Well, we both understand perfectly well that Russia might have been preparing some kind of retaliatory strike, a missile or missile drone attack, to show what they are capable of, to make the whole world afraid. Were they planning this against Ukrainian territory? Yes, I think they are planning to, but let's look at this from another point of view. On June 1st, explosions occurred directly at airfields on Russian territory. June 1st. As of now, when I'm recording this video, it's already June 5th on our calendar. They start talking about the Oreshnik. They start looking for some frequencies where negotiations are being conducted during the flights of the doomsday planes and so on. Of course, the planes are conducting negotiations. But notice, as soon as this incident happened, Putin disappeared. Where is Putin? Putin is hiding. Putin is in the bunker. He didn't even go online. He didn't even record a video. He appeared only after the fact. Obviously, they didn't let Putin out because he was shaken, because of that list and the anxiety that happened. Well, that's also reality. And they couldn't adequately mobilize or take any concrete measures. Peskov said that Putin was watching everything online. Well, of course, and that's why they really couldn't do anything to counter it. The fact that, yes, of course, the risks of large-scale missile and drone attacks remain in the near future is a fact, and we need to stay vigilant. That's obvious. But time is slipping away. As always, Putin and now Russia are delaying this moment for certain reasons, technical reasons, because they can't help but coordinate their actions and align them with Trump. Well, that's also obvious. Otherwise, why would he need to inform Trump? I will be forced to respond to Ukraine's actions and so on, dragging it out, dragging this on. Well, that's obvious too. But when it comes to the level of a superpower, the way Russia wanted to present itself, the way Putin wanted to spread this through his propaganda, they clearly fall short because you simply can't act this way. Everyone was expecting something, saying that there would be a Russian strike any moment, but it hasn't happened. So again, in many ways, these threats just don't actually work. But the risk of a strike still remains. I will keep an eye on this. If I get any relevant information, of course, I will let you know. And actually, something rather strange happened with former US President Trump's social network, Truth Social, after his conversation with Putin. Whether it was the Kremlin's magnetic storms or something else, Trump first made a post, then deleted it. So what was written was that they discussed the attack, and then he restored the post again. We discussed Ukraine's attack on Russian aircraft that were parked on the tarmac, as well as various other attacks happening on both sides. It was a good conversation, but not the kind of conversation that will lead to immediate peace. We also discussed Iran and the fact that time is running out for Iran to make a decision regarding nuclear weapons. I told President Putin that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons, and I believe that on this issue we are in agreement. Putin suggested that he would participate in negotiations with Iran and so on. And there was a reaction. Trump corrected him because he was talking about how Putin would be forced to respond saying, "Understand Putin." Well, Trump supposedly even tried to sympathize and justify the impression of the Russian dictator, as if to say he has no other choice, it's Ukraine and so on. And actually, Putin also came out and made a statement. I mean, he kept waiting for quite a long time, staying hidden away from everyone, trying to avoid being seen, and he was clearly very shaken up by everything that had happened to him. Eventually, after some time had passed, he finally gathered the courage to come out of hiding and started talking in detail about what had happened to him, explaining the whole situation to those around him, and then he held a meeting to discuss everything further. And the Russian delegation conveyed Putin's position that a meeting at the level of heads of state with Ukraine is possible with proper preparation, Medinsky said at the meeting. The explosive devices used to blow up the bridge in the Bryansk region were packed with foreign explosives and equipped with a Ukrainian-made unit. Kiev's refusal of a humanitarian ceasefire on certain sections of the front is a gross mistake, Lavrov said. These are the areas where for 2 or 3 days they proposed to retrieve the dead soldiers. Well, in fact, this is a distortion of the facts because at that time the president of Ukraine responded clearly that we want a ceasefire so that there are no casualties at all. But the Russians are proposing a ceasefire just to collect the dead. And at that time, Zelensky called the Russian delegation idiots, I'd like to remind you. Then they said that it is important not to give in to provocations from Kiev aimed at disrupting the negotiations. Putin stated that he had been informed about Zelensky's negative comments regarding the Russian delegation. Well, you see, everything is the opposite, exactly the other way around. So, who is actually disrupting the negotiation process now? And who is dragging it out? And who is manipulating it? Who is carrying out terrorist strikes against our country? And who is actually committing violence? Who is acting in a sadistic manner? Russia, Putin. And they are trying to accuse us of this. Well, there's nothing new here. So that means Putin is talking about Kiev's request for a meeting at the highest level. What is there to talk about under these circumstances? Who negotiates with terrorists? He calls us terrorists? In reality, there's only one terrorist here, Putin, and he noted that it is not up to the Kiev regime to judge the level of the Russian delegation and so on. If a pause is given in the fighting, it will be used to supply Kiev with more weapons, continue forced mobilization, and prepare terrorist attacks. So, once again, we haven't heard anything new here. It's a clear stalling by Russia of any negotiation process. Well, and Putin held his first conversation. So we also had a historic event. The Antichrist, the representative of the forces of evil on earth, Putin, a Satanist, had a phone conversation with the representative of the forces of good on earth, Pope Leo XIII. Putin accused the Ukrainian armed forces of striking civilian infrastructure on Russian territory, expressed gratitude to the Vatican for its willingness to help facilitate a peaceful resolution, and reaffirmed Moscow's interest in a diplomatic solution. The dictator also spoke about the agreements reached in Istanbul, including preparations for the exchange of prisoners and the bodies of the deceased. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a separate issue, as is the Moscow Patriarchate. Putin expressed hope that the Vatican would continue to advocate for freedom of religion in Ukraine. In other words, Putin really can't defend himself or the real Russia, except by talking to Trump. Aside from asking the Pope for protection, well, that's the trend we're seeing. But let me remind you of what I mentioned earlier. Do you remember when Leo XIV was elected Pope? I mentioned that the Vatican would become more actively involved in mediation and in efforts to resolve the Russian-Ukrainian war. In other words, the Vatican even offered a venue for the meeting. The Vatican is acting actively and evidently has also begun to take diplomacy seriously. And this conversation with Putin, as well as the audience, the first audience granted by the Pope, which was an honor bestowed upon President Zelensky of Ukraine and the First Lady, this also says a lot. In other words, the Vatican is actively getting involved. Well, but Putin's meeting doesn't tell us anything new here, nor does it give us anything new. Everything is clear. Zelensky responded to all of this, clearly stating that Putin is once again trying to show the world the middle finger and nothing more. Meanwhile, the US President's Special Representative for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, stated that Putin's special operation, Webb, has increased the level of risks in the war with Russia for Ukraine, although he did acknowledge the boldness of the operation. Kellogg noted that with this special operation, Ukraine demonstrated its ability to strike Russian targets deep within Russian territory. He emphasized that the significance of these strikes lies not so much in the destruction of aircraft, but in the psychological impact they had on the Russian leadership and military. But Kellogg expressed concerns that this could increase the risk of escalation. Oh, go to hell already with your talk about escalation levels. We've already been through it and seen it all. Let's have some new words and expressions to talk about. Sorry about that. Let's change the record. The President of Ukraine said that now we have leverage and special operations are being carried out so that we have this leverage, including at the negotiating table. We are not refusing these negotiations, and we never have. But we need a position of strength. And now, when we still do not have clarity from our strategic partner, the United States of America, regarding what our future supply of weapons will be, and we really do not have an answer to this right now, we would like to get some clarity at least before then, so that we can understand how we will be able to secure a strong position for ourselves at the negotiating table. And this clarity lies in the fact that we can achieve it through such long-range strikes to defend ourselves and what is ours. By the way, many of our partners understand this, Britain, Germany, and not only them. A meeting of the contact group in the Ramstein format took place where support for Ukraine was discussed. There are results because, for example, the United Kingdom will provide Ukraine with 100,000 drones by the end of by April 2026. They will invest £350 million or $473 million to increase the supply of drones to Ukraine. Germany is also allocating a $5 billion package. This is for the coming years, aimed at the production of long-range systems, including drones and other means of destruction, which will make it possible to strike the enemy. Belgium, the Netherlands, and other European countries are getting involved and will also be supplying, among other things, unmanned boats and other types of weaponry, which is also good. This is very important. So Ramstein continues to operate. The US Secretary of Defense, Austin, was once again not present at it, but nevertheless, it is actually working. And in fact, NATO confirms Ukraine's participation in the June summit in The Hague. But right now, they are considering a format that would avoid provoking Trump by having the President of Ukraine present. This is not a very wise decision because, as we saw during the funeral ceremony of Pope Francis, when President Zelensky and Trump met, nothing extraordinary happened. Everything was fine. They talked, and there was even some hope that this meeting would bring certain progress. So I think, on the contrary, it is necessary to allow such contacts and meetings to take place. And Trump is also flying to the NATO summit. This was officially confirmed by the White House, so there really will be an opportunity to meet there. Meanwhile, Ukraine is still receiving aid from the US that was approved by the previous presidential administration. As for new deliveries, there are not even any decisions yet, and it is not even known whether they will happen. After all, Trump is taking steps to end the war and wants Ukraine to receive financial assistance from Europe. At the same time, intelligence sharing and a stable Starlink system are being provided as before. This is according to the US ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker. In other words, he says that Trump does not want to finance Ukraine right now. Let Europe provide the funding. And for now, he is not supplying weapons, supposedly to push Ukraine toward peace. Well, that's how he puts it, but it should be rephrased. We are not giving weapons because we want the war to stop, for Ukraine to halt its operations and so on. But I don't think that will happen. However, as Whitaker pointed out, intelligence sharing and the stable operation of Starlink are being maintained. I believe this was the foundation that also helped and continued to provide information to Ukraine, which in turn made Operation Web even more successful. Well, US Senator Blumenthal was impressed by Operation Web, comparing the SBU's operation on Russian territory to the mission to eliminate Osama bin Laden. This was reported by Politico, so in fact we do have quite a bit of support. Meanwhile, Musk is increasingly criticizing Trump. He criticized Trump's budget spending bill. I can't take this anymore. This huge, outrageous, bloated, wasteful budget bill from Congress. Disgusting filth, says Musk. Shame on those who voted for it. You know what you did was wrong? Well, in fact, Musk is increasingly speaking out publicly against Trump, which was also predictable that their paths have diverged. Well, friends, despite everything, we are confidently moving forward together with God's help. Subscribe to the channel, like, and share the video. Take care of yourselves. Glory to Ukraine.